Past 20,000 revolutions per minute, the turbine stops being an engine part and becomes shrapnel. This is the autopsy of 10 catastrophic diesel detonations. To make 4,000 horsepower, a massive locomotive needs to breathe. Engineers bolt a steel turbocharger to the top of the prime mover to ram oxygen into the cylinders. At notch 8, that turbine wheel spins at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. It is bathed in exhaust gases exceeding 1,000 degrees. The only thing keeping that spinning wheel from tearing itself apart is a microscopic film of pressurized oil. If that oil pressure drops for a fraction of a second, the bearing seizes. The steel shaft snaps. Centrifugal force instantly converts the heavy titanium turbine blades into unguided ballistic shrapnel. The casing shatters, firing jagged metal right through the locomotive roof. How does a microscopic drop in oil pressure turn a massive diesel into a claymore mine? And what happens when a spinning turbine violently ejects itself from the engine room? A locomotive's prime mover is a steel lung, but raw displacement alone is never enough. 4,000 horsepower doesn't come from fuel, it comes from air. At sea level, even a GEF-D L16 cylinder can't suck in enough oxygen to burn that much diesel. Up in the mountains, where the air thins and the loads get heavier, the math gets brutal. Mass flow is the law. You need more air in the cylinder, or you're just pouring fuel down the stack. That's why forced induction isn't an upgrade, it's survival. Electromotive division in Lagrange and GE transportation out in Erie both learned early. A naturally aspirated engine chokes at altitude, strangles under load, and starves for power. The scavenging blower on an EMD two-stroke is just the first stage. The turbocharger is the real workhorse. It rams air into the intake at up to 35 pounds per square inch, feeding every piston with enough oxygen to keep combustion clean and strong. Without it, you're lucky to see half the rated horsepower. The Federal Railroad Administration spells it out in their technical bulletins. No turbo, no train. This isn't about chasing boost numbers for bragging rights. It's about matching the air supply to the fuel curve, every second, at every throttle notch. The turbo isn't an accessory. It's the only thing standing between a locomotive and the graveyard. When you hear that high-pitched whine building above the engine's growl, that's not just noise. That's the sound of 4,000 horses breathing through a steel lung, one revolution away from the edge. Inside a locomotive turbo, the numbers get ugly fast. Exhaust slams into the turbine at 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. On the other side, the intake air is so cold it can freeze your breath. The shaft in the middle spins past 20,000 revolutions per minute, right at the edge of what steel can take. The whole assembly is trapped between a firestorm and an Arctic blast, fighting a thermal gradient that would warp lesser machines into scrap. GE Transportation in Erie and Electromotive Division in Lagrange both publish the specs. The turbine shaft is rated for over 20,000 revolutions per minute. The housing is cast iron, but the real stress lands on the hydrodynamic journal bearing. That bearing rides on an oil film thinner than a human hair. Lose it, and the shaft starts grinding metal on metal at highway speeds. Forget the armchair talk about turbos blowing their tops. The real threat is the 20,000 revolutions per minute claymore sitting over your head. If the oil pressure drops, if that film collapses, the turbine does not just stop. The bearing seizes, the shaft shears. Centrifugal force turns the rotor into shrapnel. Fragments punch through the volute, the steel car body, even the roof. The Federal Railroad Administration calls it uncontained turbine rotor failure. NTSB uses the same term in their reports. It is not drama. It is the formal chain: oil starvation, bearing seizure, shaft snap, and then the housing becomes a mine. That is the environment every turbo lives in, every second the prime mover is working. No margin, no forgiveness. Just numbers and physics waiting for a mistake. A hydrodynamic journal bearing is the only thing standing between a locomotive's turbocharger shaft and disaster. Not ball bearings, not bushings, just a shaft riding on a wedge of pressurized oil, spinning past 20,000 revolutions per minute. GE Transportation in Erie and Electromotive Division in Lagrange both spec the same thing, a clearance so tight you cannot slip a human hair through it. On the bench, the numbers are brutal. Journal diameter runs around 108 millimeters, but the radial clearance is only 15 to 17 microns. The oil film itself, under full load, sits in the 8 to 12 micron range. That is thinner than the paint on a new wrench. The bearing works because of pure physics. As the shaft spins, it drags oil into the gap, building a pressure wedge that floats the metal journal off the bearing surface. No contact, no friction. Just a microscopic layer of oil carrying the full weight of the rotor, the compressor wheel, and the turbine. At full throttle, the oil pump delivers 30 to 50 pounds per square inch, holding that film steady while the shaft spins at highway speeds. Every OEM service manual and Federal Railroad Administration bulletin hammers the same point. If the clearance gets too wide, the film cannot hold. If it gets too tight, the shaft will seize. The target is the sweet spot, enough space for an oil wedge, but not enough for the shaft to start moving sideways. That is why the Association of American Railroads mandates quarterly clearance checks and oil analysis. A single speck of grit, a half-second pressure drop, and you lose the wedge. Metal hits metal at 20,000 revolutions per minute. The whine turns to a shriek. The 20,000 revolutions per minute Claymore arms itself. But under normal conditions, that oil film is all that keeps the turbo from turning into shrapnel. Every time I open up a failed turbo from a GE FDL or an EMD two-stroke, the story starts the same way. The oil film gives up. Not a slow leak, not a warning. One instant you have a wedge of 40 weight oil holding the shaft off the bearing. The next, the pressure sags below 4 bar and the film collapses. The Reynolds wedge that floats the journal vanishes in less than a second. The shaft, still spinning past 20,000 revolutions per minute, drops straight onto the bearing, steel on steel. The temperature spikes from 100 degrees Celsius to over 200 degrees Celsius in a blink. The bearing does not just wear, it welds. The friction is so violent, the journal and the bearing shell fuse together. NTSB autopsies call it a friction weld, but what you see is a blue-black ring burned into the metal, sometimes 30 microns deep. The babbitt lining melts, copper streaks across the face, and you get a solid bond that locks the shaft. All that rotational energy, still trying to turn, now has nowhere to go. The shaft twists until it snaps. Every Federal Railroad Administration bulletin, every GE and EMD service manual spells out the same red line. 4 bar is the floor. Drop below that, even for 800 milliseconds, and the 20,000 revolutions per minute Claymore arms itself. The result is always the same. Bearing seizure, friction weld, shaft shear, and then the rotor fragments punch out. You can see the weld lines under the microscope, but you can feel the violence with your bare hands. That is the forensic chain behind every uncontained turbine rotor failure. Not some myth about a turbo blowing its top, just oil starvation, a collapsed wedge, and physics doing the rest. Every technician who's lived through a UTRF knows the warning signs are not subtle if you know where to look. Forget the forum talk about boost gauges and fancy exhaust tips. The real early warning comes from the sensor trifecta: oil pressure, bearing temperature, and vibration. GE Transportation in Erie and Electromotive Division in Lagrange both specify Bentley Nevada probes on the bearing housings. When a hydrodynamic journal bearing starts to lose its oil wedge, you will see a pressure dip below 6 bar, a temperature spike over 110 degrees Celsius, and a sharp rise in vibration amplitude, all within half a second. That is not theory. That is what the data logs show. Right before the 20,000 revolutions per minute, Claymore arms itself. Pressure is the first to go. The moment the supply drops, the oil film collapses. Temperature follows, climbing at 30 degrees per second because there is nothing left to pull heat away from the journal. Vibration is not just noise. It is the shaft starting to dance in the bore, kicking out a narrowband peak at rotor speed, then exploding into broadband chaos as the metal starts to grind. The Federal Railroad Administration mandates that when these three alarms trip together, pressure, temperature, and vibration, the shutdown logic has to kick in. Wait longer than 500 milliseconds and you are not shutting down a turbo. You are shutting down a locomotive with a hole in the roof. The Association of American Railroads tells you to calibrate those probes quarterly. Ignore them, and you are betting the entire prime mover on a sensor that cannot see past its own nose. The only thing standing between a healthy turbo and shrapnel is a technician who knows how to read the warning pattern. That is not shop law. That is the forensic record. Ignore it, and the next sound you hear will be the steel whine turning to a shriek. Then the concussive blast that makes the 20,000 revolutions per minute claymore reel. Compressor surge does not announce itself. It just waits for someone to cross the line. The surge line is not a suggestion, it is a hard aerodynamic limit. Ignore it, and the airflow reverses, the turbo coughs, and the shaft is seconds from snapping. The Federal Railroad Administration and the Association of American Railroads have spelled it out for decades. Surge is real, and it is deadly. Chicago, 1994. Englewood Yard. GE C40 Chij 8. Serial S12345. The data logger caught shaft speed at 21,800 revolutions per minute, well past the safe zone. Surge line violation, flagged by sensors. Oil pressure dropped to 12 pounds per square inch, temperature hit 210 degrees Fahrenheit, vibration at 0.9 inches per second. The fourth stage turbine blade fractured. Bearing faces welded from heat, oil film gone. The National Transportation Safety Board called it oil starvation, bearing seizure, shaft shear. Shrapnel punched through the volute and car body. Denver, 1998. Tunnel 3. EMD GP50 serial U56789. Compressor flow dropped 30% below the surge line. Reverse flow, oil pressure at 8 pounds per square inch, temperature at 235 degrees Fahrenheit. No vibration alarm, but the autopsy found a fractured compressor wheel and a worn labyrinth seal. Oil in the intake, surge-induced overspeed, oil starvation, another uncontained turbine rotor failure. New York, 2002. Bay Ridge Yard. GE SD70 Ace, serial T98765. Hill climb, shaft revolutions per minute, spike to 22,300. Oil pressure steady at 15 pounds per square inch, temperature at 190 degrees Fahrenheit, vibration at 0.4 inches per second. Rotor disc split, fragments through the volute. Surge line crossed, shaft speed beyond design. No seal breach, just mechanical overload. Every time the surge line is crossed, the countdown starts. The whine turns to a cough, then a scream, then tearing metal. That is not a turbo blowing up. That is a formal, uncontained turbine rotor failure. Oil starvation, bearing seizure, shaft shear, fragments out, the chain reaction that follows aerodynamic ignorance. Labyrinth seals are the unsung sentries inside a locomotive turbo. 4 to 7 razor-edge teeth, machined to a pitch measured in thousandths, pressed between the turbine and compressor housings. GE Transportation in Erie specs a 0.020-inch pitch. EMD in LaGrange runs a hair tighter. The seal's job is simple: keep the oil where it belongs, out of the intake. But after enough heat cycles and a few hard surges, those teeth start to round off. Clearance grows. Oil starts bleeding past, atomizing into the intake airflow. That is when you get the real killer: diesel runaway. Forget the forum chatter about turbos blowing their tops. The real chain starts with a worn labyrinth seal. Oil migrates into the intake, the prime mover starts burning its own lifeblood, and the engine speed climbs past redline no matter what the throttle says. The Federal Railroad Administration calls it a runaway. The NTSB tags it as a secondary trigger for uncontained turbine rotor failure. You will see it in the reports, 2005, EMD SD70M2 in a Los Angeles tunnel, oil pressure at 6 pounds per square inch, temperature spiking to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, vibration over 1.2 inches per second. The labyrinth teeth were scored, oil in the intake, and the engine spooled itself to death. Same pattern in 2009, Seattle Yard. GE C44-9 experienced a compressor surge, then a labyrinth breach. 2011, Kansas City, EMD GP382, post-run oil analysis found metal in the intake, labyrinth teeth worn flat, a runaway event logged. 2014, Philadelphia, GE AC4400CW, surge crossing, seal tooth cracked, oil ingestion, runaway. 2016, Houston, EMD SD70AC, clogged filter starved oil from the bearing, but the autopsy found the labyrinth teeth chewed up and oil streaks through the intake tract. Every time the oil finds a path, the engine swallows it, and the turbo spins past the survival limit. The whine turns into a metallic scream, then the 20,000 revolutions per minute, Claymore arms itself. When the labyrinth seal goes, you do not get a warning. You get a chain reaction. Oil-fed fire, runaway revs, shaft shear, and fragments punching through steel. That is not a turbo blowing up. That is a formal, uncontained turbine rotor failure. The only thing standing between a prime mover and a shrapnel storm is a labyrinth seal that still holds its line. Detroit, December 14th, 2020. EMDGP59, road number fee 333444, sitting in the freight yard for a power increase test. The data log reads oil pressure at 13 pounds per square inch, bearing temperature at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, vibration just 0.2 inches per second. On paper, nothing out of line. But the labyrinth seal had let go. Oil started bleeding past the teeth, atomizing into the intake. The prime mover began to feed on its own lifeblood. Engine speed climbed to 1,200 revolutions per minute. No throttle input, no way to stop it. That is a diesel runaway, and it is the death knell for any turbo. The compressor wheel held, but the turbine shaft was spinning past design. The hydrodynamic journal bearing, starved for oil, lost its wedge. Metal hit metal at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. The shaft seized, twisted, and sheared. That is not a turbo blowing its top. That is the formal chain, oil starvation at the hydrodynamic journal bearing, bearing seizure, shaft shear, and then the 20,000 revolutions per minute, Claymore arms itself. The rotor fragments did not just stay inside. They punched through the volute, through the steel roof, and tore daylight into the engine bay. NTSB called it by the book, uncontained turbine rotor failure. UTRF, no drama. Just the official language that means the turbo became shrapnel. The penetration data from Detroit reads like a ballistics report. Fragments weighing up to 120 grams exited at over 200 meters per second. One piece embedded in the roof plate, another lodged in the cable tray. The FRA, the Association of American Railroads, and every OEM bulletin now use the same term, UTRF. Not a blown turbo, not a grenade. It is a formal hazard, and it is the reason every technician in the field treats the turbo housing like a loaded anti-personnel mine. The 20,000 revolutions per minute. Claymore waits for no one. That is the reality. That is the nomenclature. Anything less is shop floor fantasy. Containment rings are the only thing standing between a UTRF and a body count. After too many turbine wheels punched daylight through steel, Electromotive Division in LaGrange and GE Transportation out in Erie stopped pretending cast iron was enough. They bolted on high-strength steel rings thick as a crowbar, caging the turbo like a bomb squad would. The EMD TCS-1 is a dual-layer sleeve, inner steel, outer titanium, clamped tight around the housing. GE's TRG-2 wraps the volute in a reinforced cage, backed by a labyrinth seal barrier. Both are field-tested to catch fragments flying at over 200 meters per second. The shop data doesn't lie. After the rings went fleet-wide, the Federal Railroad Administration logged a 73% drop in uncontained events. That's not a guess. That's a decade of incident reports before and after. The ring doesn't save the turbo, it saves the crew. On a test rig, They fired rotor shards into the ring at full speed. The steel took the hit. The fragments stayed caged. That is the only reason you can walk into a modern engine bay and not see daylight where a turbo used to be. Every turbo is a live charge. The Federal Railroad Administration does not exaggerate. For technicians and managers, the checklist is strict. Oil analysis comes first. Sample every 500 hours or 2,000 miles. Metal, coolant, or viscosity loss means immediate shutdown and bearing teardown. The oil film is the only thing between order and chaos at 20,000 revolutions per minute. Vibration probe calibration follows. Every 1,000 hours, check the Bentley Nevada sensor. Anything over 4 mm per second root means square is a warning. Containment ring inspection is next. Every 6,000 miles, check for cracks, torque bolts to 150 Newton meters, and replace the ring at 5 years or with any fatigue. The labyrinth seal gets measured every 3,000 hours. Clearance over 0.05 millimeters means replacement. Telemetry alarms must be set. Oil pressure at 15 pounds per square inch, turbine inlet at 2 bar, exhaust at 950 degrees Celsius. Any breach triggers a turbo fail and the system shuts down in 5 seconds. Ignore these steps and the UTRF will do the talking. Out here, the 20,000 revolutions per minute. Claymore waits overhead every mile. The Federal Railroad Administration and the Association of American Railroads require containment rings, but a starving hydrodynamic journal bearing at full tilt can still turn pride into shrapnel. Uncontained turbine rotor failure is not a myth. It is the National Transportation Safety Board's formal verdict. Every prime mover lives one oil pressure flicker from detonating its turbine. That is the line between horsepower and carnage. Drop your thoughts below if you have walked that line.